In the vast and lonely empty of space, where the light of stars barely illuminated the ends of the universe, the scientific ship Helios 7 captured a sign. Weak, irregular, but definitely human. The team, consisting of trained scientists and explorers, gathered in the command room, while Captain Elena Park analyzed the projected data on the room around the room. "This broadcast is impossible," communications technician murmured Dr. Marcus Reed, frowning. "The origin seems to be a missing ship for over 50 years. Erebus." The name caused an uncomfortable silence in the room. Erebus was a legend between space explorers, a missing ship on an exploration mission in the most inhospitable regions of the galaxy. No crew has been found. No detected destroy. Just silence, so far. The signal seemed weak, like an echo dying in an abyss. "It may be a mistake," suggested Dr. Layla Huang, the team's astrophysics, although uncertainty in her voice cheated on what she really thought. But there was something in the tone of that transmission, an unusual sequence of wrists and tones, that caused almost unbearable curiosity. "If it is Erebus, we need to check. It is our obligation as scientists," Elena insisted, with a firm look that ended any debate. Thus, they adjusted the course of Helios 7 to follow the source of the signal, towards what seemed to be a forgotten fragment of the past. As they approached the ship, the crew discomfort increased. Erebus outer lights were still lit, though weak and intermittent, as if the ship was dying. The external structure seemed untouched, but there was a frightening absence of movement. No sign of evacuation, no sound beyond low vacuum buzz. "Minimum energy detected," said Marcus while analyzing the data. "Life support systems are technically active, but everything is in a state of conservation." Elena ordered a team to prepare to board. The main door was sealed, but the system seemed still functional. "It's as if the ship is waiting for us," Layla murmured, with a shiver running her spine. As soon as the Helios 7 portal was connected to the Erebus hull, the silence became almost palpable. The access corridor was a metallic tunnel that amplified each sound: the sibilance of space attire, the heavy steps of the explorers, and, occasionally, the sound of something no one could identify. When the team activated Erebus's opening system, the door slid with almost human creak, revealing an interior covered with cosmic dust. The corridors were illuminated only by flashing lights, throwing shadows that seemed to move. "Welcome to the past," Elena said, trying to sound confident, but her words were swallowed by the oppression of the place. Inside the ship, the air was heavy and stagnant. The technology seemed outdated but still functional. Marcos analyzed a main console when he found something, an electronic signal. "It seems to be a trip diary. It's still here." The team was about to unravel the secrets of what happened to Erebus, but barely knew that when awakening the ship, something else would wake up. The sound of the Erebus portal sealing behind the Helios 7 team reverberated through the corridors as a metallic whisper that refused to disappear. "We are officially inside," said Marcus as he adjusted his flashlight to cut the oppressive dim light. The atmosphere was a mosaic of flashing lights and suffocating darkness. Each step of the team echoed like a slow drum beating, creating a disturbing soundtrack for the expedition. The air was dense and loaded with a metallic and sour smell, as something that had long been forgotten. "It seems that no one has been here for decades," said Layla, the eyes attentive to the details around her. But in his mind something whispered a doubt: no one alive. While exploring the main corridor, they noticed marks on the walls, deep scratches that did not match any standard tools. "These marks, they seem done by something that was trying to leave," said Elena, the voice loaded with suspicion. They arrived at the command bridge, an open space where damaged consoles projected static and incomplete holograms. Marcus activated the central terminal, and immediately an electronic diary appeared on the screen. The title of the file made the heart of the team accelerate: "Final Report, Captain Adam Voss." The first entrance to the diary came on the screen, accompanied by an audio recording. Adam Voss's voice was confident, almost excited, describing Erebus's initial mission and exploitation of unexplored star systems in the search for habitable planets. The account was meticulous, reporting discoveries of asteroids rich in fascinating minerals and spatial anomalies. But as the team watched, small details began to stand out. "There is something watching us," said a marginal note in one of the entries of the diary. "The sensors detect nothing, but the crew swears that you see shadows moving where there should be nothing." Marcus paused the diary and looked at Elena. "This seems to be the beginning of some kind of collective psychosis. They may have been isolated a long time," he suggested. But the captain shook her head. "Not so fast. Let's continue. I want more context." As more entrances were reproduced, the tone of the diary changed. Enthusiasm gave way to restlessness, and restlessness became fear. "The lights fail more often," said one of the entries. "There are whispers in the hallway when there is no one there." Suddenly, the central terminal blinked, turning off for a moment before displaying a message that froze everyone in place. "You shouldn't be here." Layla's heart almost jumped from her chest. "This is a system failure or—" he started, but was interrupted by a distant sound. A sound that looked like a breath. Not human, but something bigger. The explorers looked at each other. Marcus tried to reactivate the terminal, but something seemed to resist. "This ship is aware of our presence," he said, hesitated. Elena, trying to maintain the composure, ordered them to continue to explore, while a part of the team was to try to restore the main system. The following corridors seemed narrower, as if the walls were closing around them. The shadows looked more dense, almost tangible. It was then that they found the first physical evidence of the previous crew, a torn uniform trapped in a ventilation grid, with dark spots that could be dry blood. "This makes no sense. There are no bodies. Nothing to indicate what happened to them," said Layla, analyzing the scene. But before they could sue, another sound echoed, something falling, like metal hitting the floor, coming from a nearby corridor. The team followed the sound, illuminating every corner with their lanterns, but the hallway was empty. However, on the floor, they found a small device, an Erebus crew portable recorder. Elena activated him, and the voice that came up was loaded with despair. "If you're hearing it, get out. Don't wake up. Don't let her know you're here." The recording ended abruptly, and the tension in the team increased. The group decided to return to the command bridge, but upon returning, they realized that something had changed. The electronic diary displayed a new entrance, created seconds ago. "You aroused something." The silence of the Erebus ship began to gain weight, an almost physical presence that seeped into the thoughts of the Helios 7 team. Returning to the bridge, the message on the central terminal flashed. "You have awakened something." That shouldn't be possible," Marcus muttered, as his fingers danced over the controls, trying to figure out who, or what, could have generated the entrance. "There are no signs of operational artificial intelligence on this craft. Nothing should be working like this." Captain Elena Park, feeling the weight of uncertainty, ordered the team to continue to access Erebus' electronic diary. "We need to know what happened here before we jump to conclusions," he said, trying to sound resolute. Another audio input was played, but this time, the tone was different. Captain Adam Voss's voice was tense, fragmented by hesitation. "We are facing something we cannot understand. It's not in the sensors. We can't see him, but we know he's here. One by one, my crew is disappearing, or worse." Voss's words fell like a death sentence, echoing in the silence of the bridge. "Disappearing?" asked Layla, almost in a whisper. And what did he mean by "or worse"? Before they could argue, the distant sound of metal being dragged made its way down the hallway behind them. "Has anyone else heard that?" asked Jonas, the youngest of the team, his hand instinctively landing on his cutting tool. Following the sound, the group found a partially sealed compartment. The atmosphere around it felt different, heavier, colder. Marcus's visor detected unexplained temperature changes, as if something was draining heat from the environment. "This is not physical, it defies natural laws," he said, his eyes fixed on his instruments. When they opened the compartment, they were confronted with a disturbing sight, a space filled with drawings and messages scrawled on the walls, all made with what looked like blood. The words formed chaotic patterns, but one phrase stood out: "Don't trust the light." Layla was analyzing the drawings when she noticed strange marks on the floor, footprints. "Not human." "These marks seem recent," he said, his voice barely containing his fear. While investigating, a new electronic diary entry appeared on Marcus' console, without anyone having activated it. "This is impossible," he whispered before opening the entrance. This time, Voss's voice was unrecognizable, almost a grunt. "She's here. It's everywhere. It is not life as we know it. She consumes, turns, make us hers." At that moment, the lights of the Erebus flashed violently, plunging the corridors into almost complete darkness for seconds that seemed like hours. When they returned, Jonah was staring at something in the oppressive silence aboard the Erebus had transformed into a living, breathing entity, coiling around the crew of the Helios 7 like an unseen predator. Back on the bridge, the team stared uneasily at the electronic log. Each new entry seemed to appear autonomously, as though the ship itself was desperate to share its story. Captain Elena Park, fighting against her instincts to retreat, ordered the next log entry to be played. The voice of Captain Adam Voss crackled through the speakers, his tone more panicked than before. "This thing, it's not just watching us anymore. It's learning. Adapting. It's inside the systems, inside us." His words sent chills down the spines of the Helios 7 crew. The entry included a fragmented video feed showing the Erebus crew in chaos. Some were desperately trying to barricade themselves in the engineering bay, while others wandered the corridors, speaking incoherently to something that wasn't there. "Whatever this entity is, it's feeding on us," Voss continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not alive in the way we understand, but it mimics. It becomes." The recording cut out with an ominous static, followed by a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the Erebus. Marcus attempted to analyze the ship's data logs, but the system seemed to fight back. "Every time I try to access a deeper layer, the system locks me out," he said, his frustration mounting. "It's as if the ship doesn't want us to see." Elena clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "Whatever happened to them, we need to figure it out before it happens to us." She instructed Marcus to override the system's defenses, while the rest of the team searched for clues in the surrounding areas. As the team split up, the tension grew palpable. Layla, along with a younger crew member, Jonas, ventured into the engineering wing. The corridor leading to the section was narrow and littered with debris, scraps of metal, tattered uniforms, and wires that seemed to pulse faintly as if alive. Their flashlights flickered intermittently, adding to the growing sense of unease. They found another log device lodged in a control panel. Activating it, a grainy recording began to play. It showed a member of the Erebus crew sitting alone in the dim light, muttering incomprehensibly. His eyes darted to the corners of the room as if he were being watched. "It whispers, it knows. It's inside me." The man abruptly stopped speaking, his head snapping to the camera with unnatural speed. His lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "You've come too far. Leave, or you'll become us." Jonas recoiled, stumbling back into Layla. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. But before Layla could answer, a low, rhythmic tapping echoed from deeper within the ship. It wasn't mechanical. It was deliberate. Meanwhile, back on the bridge, Marcus succeeded in bypassing part of the Erebus defenses, revealing a new log entry titled, "Containment Protocol Failed." Elena hesitated but ultimately ordered it to be played. This entry revealed the horrifying truth. The Erebus crew had encountered an anomaly, a formless, sentient entity composed of pure energy. Initially thought to be a scientific marvel, it began to infiltrate the ship's systems and, eventually, the crew themselves. "It's no longer an anomaly," Voss's voice warned. "It's a predator. And this ship, it's its body now." The entry ended with a single line scrawled across the screen: "It won't let you leave." Elena's voice cut through the silence, calm but steely. "We need to regroup. Now." But as the team attempted to reconnect, the Erebus began to respond. The walls groaned as if alive, shadows moved with purpose, and the low tapping noise morphed into a rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat reverberating through the ship. Something was awake, and it knew they were there. The sound of the heartbeat-like thrum resonated through the halls of the Erebus, a deep vibration that seemed to crawl beneath the skin of the Helios 7 crew. As Elena led the regrouping effort, the oppressive atmosphere of the ship continued to press down on them, each shadow and flickering light playing tricks on their minds. The team's radios crackled with interference, making communication fragmented and disjointed. "This ship doesn't want us here," Marcus muttered, sweat glistening on his brow as he worked to stabilize the feed from their equipment. "Or maybe it wants us here too much." Jonas and Layla were the last to arrive back at the bridge, their faces pale and their steps hurried. "We saw something," Layla began, struggling to find the right words. "It wasn't human, but it wasn't completely alien either. It shifted, like it was trying to decide what to be." Jonas, still shaken, added, "And it spoke. Not with words, but I felt it. In my head." Elena's jaw tightened. "We need answers. We'll finish decrypting the captain's logs and see if they left any clues on how to contain this thing." But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. The entity was no longer just a mystery, it was an active, malevolent force, and it was watching them. Marcus managed to unlock the next segment of the log, revealing a video feed from the Erebus's medical bay. The footage showed a crew member strapped to a table, their body convulsing as if something inside them was fighting to break free. Around them, other crew members debated whether to quarantine the affected individual or to abandon ship altogether. Their voices were drowned out by the increasingly erratic movements of the restrained crewmen. Suddenly, the person stopped moving, their body slumping lifelessly. The room fell silent until the figure's head snapped up, eyes glowing faintly, and an inhuman voice echoed, "You cannot escape what you've invited in." The video cut off abruptly, replaced by a diagram of the ship with several sections highlighted in red. "Those areas," Marcus explained, "are where the containment protocols were attempted. Looks like they were trying to trap the entity in specific sections of the ship." Elena studied the map. "If it worked, why is the entity still here?" Layla spoke up, her voice trembling. "What if the containment didn't work because it's not just in one section? What if the Erebus itself is the containment, and we're locked inside with it?" As if in response to her words, the lights dimmed and the rhythmic thrum grew louder, resonating through the deck plates. The ship's walls seemed to shift subtly, like a living organism stretching and contracting. Jonas gasped as he pointed toward a darkened corner of the bridge. "There," he whispered harshly. In the shadows, a form began to take shape, indistinct at first, a swirling mass of dark energy and shifting patterns. As it moved, it reflected fragments of the crew's faces, like a distorted mirror. It didn't walk or float but seemed to ripple through the air, its presence sending waves of nausea through the team. Elena held her ground, her voice firm despite the terror clawing at her. "What are you?" she demanded. The entity paused, its form stabilizing just enough to resemble a humanoid silhouette. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus, layers of human and alien tones blending into a sound that made their ears ache. "We are what you've left behind. What you abandoned to survive." The crew exchanged confused glances. "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, his voice shaky. But the entity didn't answer directly. Instead, it moved closer, its form pulsing with energy. Jonas stepped back instinctively, but the entity stopped and tilted its head, as if studying them. "You will understand soon enough. You will join us." Without warning, the lights flared, blinding the team. When they adjusted to the sudden brightness, the entity was gone. The bridge felt colder, the air heavier. "We can't stay here," Layla said, her voice breaking. "We need to find a way off this ship." Elena nodded reluctantly. "Agreed. But first, we need to find out how to stop this thing from following us, if that's even possible." As the team prepared to leave the bridge, Marcus paused, staring at the map of the Erebus. "Wait," he said. "The logs mentioned an auxiliary control room. If the crew tried to contain the entity, the protocols might still be accessible from there." Elena made the call. "Then that's where we're headed. Everyone, stay close. We don't split up for any reason." The rhythmic thrum of the ship seemed to follow them as they moved deeper into its haunted corridors, the faint whispers of the entity echoing in their minds. The crew of the Helios 7 moved cautiously through the dim, labyrinthine corridors of the Erebus, the ship groaning around them like a dying beast. The auxiliary control room was buried deep within the ship's core, far from the bridge and the relative safety of open spaces. Every step felt heavier, as though the oppressive atmosphere of the Erebus was actively working against them. The rhythmic thrum that had haunted them earlier now pulsed in sync with their own heartbeats, an unsettling reminder that the ship was alive in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Layla shone her flashlight down a narrow passage, catching the glint of something metallic. "Is that blood?" she whispered, crouching to examine the streaks smeared across the floor. It wasn't red but black and viscous, shimmering faintly under the beam of light. "Let's keep moving," Elena ordered, her voice firm despite the growing dread. She glanced at Marcus, who was scanning their surroundings with his handheld monitor. "Anything?" Marcus shook his head, frustration etched across his face. "It's like the ship's systems are deliberately giving me bad readings. Temperatures keep fluctuating between extremes, and I'm picking up movement, but it's everywhere." The corridors grew narrower as they descended further into the ship, forcing them to move in single file. The walls were lined with strange etchings, spirals, jagged lines, and symbols that none of them recognized. Jonas ran his hand over one of the carvings and immediately recoiled. "It's warm," he said, his voice shaking. "Why is it warm?" Before anyone could respond, a low growl reverberated through the corridor. The team froze, their breath catching in their throats. "Did anyone else hear that?" Layla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of scraping metal. Jonas tightened his grip on the tool he carried as a weapon, his eyes darting nervously. "It's coming from behind us," he hissed. Elena made a snap decision. "Move. Now." The team broke into a sprint, the sound of the growl growing louder and more guttural, like a predator closing in on its prey. They rounded a corner and stumbled into a large chamber filled with machinery. The auxiliary control room was just ahead, its heavy door partially ajar. Marcus rushed to the console near the entrance, his fingers flying over the controls. "I'll try to seal the door," he said, his voice strained. The rest of the crew fanned out, scanning the room for any signs of danger. The growl had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Elena's eyes darted around the chamber. Something felt wrong. "Marcus, hurry up," she urged. "I'm trying." Marcus snapped, sweat dripping down his face as he worked. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was their own panicked breathing. Then, a voice echoed through the room, not human, but layered and distorted, like multiple entities speaking in unison. "You've come too far." The lights returned, and standing at the far end of the chamber was the entity. Its form had solidified into something more defined, a towering figure with limbs that twisted and fractured unnaturally, its surface rippling like liquid metal. Its face, if it could be called that, was a shifting mosaic of the Erebus crew's faces, their mouths opening and closing silently as if trapped in an eternal scream. Jonas took a step back, his hand trembling. What is that?" The entity tilted its head, its glowing eyes fixating on the crew. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "You were warned." Elena stepped forward, her hand gripping her weapon tightly. "What do you want from us?" she demanded. The entity didn't respond immediately. Instead, it raised one of its twisted limbs, and the machinery around them began to hum ominously. "You cannot leave," it said finally. "You are part of the whole now." The room erupted into chaos. The machinery began to spark and overheat, panels exploding as the entity moved closer. Marcus shouted, "The controls are fried. I can't seal the door." "Then we fight our way out," Elena said, raising her weapon. But as she fired, the shots passed through the entity harmlessly, the energy dissipating into its form. It retaliated with a wave of force, sending the crew sprawling. Layla scrambled to her feet, grabbing Marcus by the arm. "There has to be another way. The logs mentioned containment. Maybe we can trap it here." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "The emergency power grid, if I can overload it, it might destabilize the entity long enough for us to escape." "Do it," Elena ordered, helping Jonas to his feet. "We'll hold it off as long as we can." Marcus dove toward a nearby console, frantically working to reroute the power. The entity, sensing his intentions, let out an otherworldly scream that shook the walls. It surged forward, its form distorting violently. "Keep it distracted," Elena shouted, firing at the machinery around the entity to create sparks and noise. Jonas and Layla joined in, using whatever tools they could find to slow it down. The room trembled as the power grid began to overload. Marcus shouted over the chaos, "I need 30 more seconds." The entity lashed out, its limbs elongating and slamming into the walls. One struck Jonas, sending him flying across the room. Layla screamed, running to his side as Marcus yelled, "It's done. Move." The crew bolted toward the exit as the power grid reached critical levels. Behind them, the entity howled in fury, its form flickering and destabilizing. The last thing they saw before the door slammed shut was the entity's face splitting into dozens of screaming visages, each one a fragment of the Erebus's doomed crew. The crew of the Helios 7 stumbled into the adjacent corridor, their breathing ragged and their bodies bruised. The heavy door of the auxiliary control room sealed behind them, muffling the enraged howls of the entity. Marcus slumped against the wall, clutching his side, while Elena quickly assessed the situation. "Jonas, are you okay?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Jonas groaned, his hand pressed against his ribs. "Nothing broken, I think," he muttered, wincing. Layla hovered nervously, her eyes darting to the door as the muffled howls faded into an unsettling silence. Elena stood, her jaw clenched. "We've bought ourselves some time, but not much. That thing will find another way out, and we need to be off this ship before it does." Marcus pulled himself upright, his face pale but determined. The logs mentioned escape pods in the lower decks. If they're still functional, we might be able to get out of here. Assuming the Erebus doesn't throw any more surprises at us, Layla added grimly. Elena nodded. Then we head for the lower decks. Stick together, and stay sharp. We're not out of this yet. The journey to the lower decks was slow and fraught with tension. The ship seemed to react to their presence, its walls groaning and shifting as if alive. Lights flickered erratically, and every so often, a metallic screech echoed through the halls, putting the crew on edge. As they descended, Marcus reviewed the ship's schematics on his handheld device. The escape pods should be just ahead, he said, his voice laced with cautious optimism. But when they reached the corridor leading to the pods, their hope turned to dread. The hallway was blocked by a tangle of debris, collapsed bulkheads, exposed wiring, and a thick layer of black, viscous fluid that pulsed faintly. Jonas stared at the obstruction, his stomach sinking. "That's not normal," he said, taking a cautious step back. Layla scanned the debris with her flashlight, her brow furrowing. "It's like the ship's trying to seal us in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus studied the obstruction, his mind racing. "We can try to cut through it, but that could take hours," he said. "And we don't have that kind of time." Elena's eyes narrowed as she considered their options. "There's got to be another way," she said. "Marcus, is there an alternate route to the pods?" Marcus hesitated, scrolling through the schematics. "There's a maintenance shaft that runs parallel to this corridor," he said finally. "It's a tight fit, but it should lead us to the pods." "Then that's our path," Elena said, determination hardening her voice. "Let's move." The maintenance shaft was cramped and dimly lit, forcing the crew to crawl single file. The air was thick and stale, and the walls were slick with condensation. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space, the scrape of their boots, the hiss of their breath, the faint creaks and groans of the ship around them. As they pressed forward, Marcus's handheld device began to glitch, its screen flickering with static. "Something's interfering with the signal," he muttered, tapping the screen in frustration. Layla glanced over her shoulder, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Do you think it's the entity?" she asked nervously. Marcus shook his head. "Could be. Or it could just be the ship falling apart." Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the shaft, followed by a sharp metallic screech. The crew froze, their hearts pounding. "What was that?" Jonas whispered, his voice tight with fear. Before anyone could respond, the walls of the shaft began to vibrate, and a dark, oily substance seeped through the seams. The fluid moved with unnatural purpose, snaking toward the crew like living tendrils. "Go!" Elena shouted, pushing Marcus forward. "Don't stop!" The crew scrambled through the shaft, the tendrils of fluid chasing them relentlessly. The substance glimmered faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the ship's eerie heartbeat. Jonas slipped, his hand brushing against the fluid, and let out a strangled cry as it burned his skin. "Get up!" Layla screamed, pulling him to his feet. Together, they stumbled forward, the tendrils closing in. The crew burst out of the shaft and into the escape pod bay, slamming the hatch shut behind them. Marcus quickly locked the door, but the sound of the tendrils scraping against the metal sent chills down their spines. "There!" Layla pointed to the row of escape pods, their small, spherical forms illuminated by flickering emergency lights. "Are they functional?" Marcus rushed to the nearest console, his fingers flying over the controls. "3 of them are operational," he said, relief evident in his voice. "We can make it." Elena stepped forward, her expression grim. "Then let's not waste any time. Everyone, into the pods." As the crew prepared to board, the ship seemed to shudder violently, and a deep, guttural roar echoed through the bay. The tendrils began to seep through the edges of the hatch, their movements frantic and aggressive, Move! Elena shouted, ushering the crew into the pods. Marcus and Layla climbed into one, while Jonas took the second. Elena hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the bay. She could feel the entity's presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on her. As she climbed into the third pod, the tendrils burst through the hatch, surging toward them. Elena slammed the pod's door shut just as the tendrils reached it, their oily surface smearing against the reinforced glass. Marcus's voice crackled over the comms. Initiating launch sequence now. The escape pods ejected from the Erebus, hurtling into the void of space. As they drifted away, the crew watched through their windows as the Erebus seemed to writhe, its structure distorting and twisting as if in agony. But even as the ship disappeared into the darkness, a chilling thought lingered in their minds: the entity wasn't gone. And it might not be bound to the Erebus after all. The escape pods floated silently through the endless void of space, their thrusters stabilizing the crew's trajectory toward the Helios 7. Inside each pod, the survivors struggled to process what had just transpired aboard the Erebus. The distant stars offered no comfort, their cold light casting faint shadows across their faces as silence pressed against them like a suffocating blanket. Inside her pod, Elena gripped the sides of her chair, her knuckles white. She stared out the small window, watching as the Erebus grew smaller and smaller, its dark form blending into the abyss. Her comm system crackled to life, Marcus's voice cutting through the static. "Everyone, is everyone still with me?" "Barely," Jonas replied, his voice shaky but intact. "What the hell just happened?" "That thing, it wasn't just a creature. It was something else, something wrong." Layla's voice came next, quieter but tinged with a nervous energy. "We made it out, but does anyone feel like it's not over? Like it's still with us somehow?" The line went silent for a moment as the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Elena finally spoke, her voice calm but laced with authority. "We'll figure it out once we're back on the Helios 7. Right now, focus on staying steady. We're not out of danger yet." As the pods neared the Helios 7, an uneasy tension settled over the group. Marcus glanced at the readings on his control panel, his brow furrowing. "That's strange," he muttered, tapping the screen. "What is it?" Elena asked, her voice cutting through the comms. "There's interference," Marcus replied. "It's faint, but it's there. It's almost identical to what we picked up on the Erebus." Jonas let out a nervous laugh, the sound hollow. "You're saying the entity followed us?" "I don't know," Marcus said. "But we can't rule it out. We need to be ready for anything." The pods docked with the Helios 7 smoothly, their automated systems guiding them into the ship's hangar bay. As the airlocks hissed open, the survivors stepped out cautiously, their eyes scanning the familiar surroundings for any signs of danger. The hangar was quiet, the hum of the ship's engines a welcome contrast to the eerie silence of the Erebus. Elena took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "Layla, check the air quality and make sure nothing from the Erebus contaminated the ship. Marcus, run a full diagnostic on the systems and look for any anomalies. Jonas, you're with me. We're going to secure the bridge." The team moved quickly, their exhaustion outweighed by the lingering fear of what might still be lurking. Marcus worked at the nearest console, his fingers flying over the controls as he pulled up the ship's diagnostics. His heart sank as he noticed the faint interference again, a subtle but persistent signal embedded within the system. "Elena," he called out over the comms. "I'm seeing something, a residual signal. It's not part of the Helios VII system. Can you isolate it?" Elena asked, her voice tense. "I'm trying," Marcus replied, frustration evident in his tone. "But it's not behaving like normal data. It's almost alive." On the bridge, Elena and Jonas worked to bring the ship's systems online. The screens flickered momentarily, and for a brief second, Elena thought she saw something, a shadow, or a face, reflected in the glass. She blinked, and it was gone. "Elena," Jonas said, his voice low. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Elena asked, her hand instinctively moving to the weapon holstered at her side. Jonas hesitated, his eyes scanning the room. "I don't know." It was like a shape, moving in the reflection. Before Elena could respond, the ship's lights dimmed, and the familiar sound of static crackled through the comms. A distorted voice echoed through the speakers, layered in and human. "You cannot escape." The bridge fell silent as the voice faded, replaced by the faint hum of the ship's systems. Elena clenched her jaw, her mind racing. "Marcus, report." "What's happening?" Marcus's voice came through the comms, strained but steady. "I don't know how, but the interference is spreading. It's in the system now." Layla's voice broke in, panic rising. "How is that possible?" "We left it behind." Elena gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white. "It must have transferred itself somehow, through the logs, the data, maybe even the pods." She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "We need to isolate it before it takes control of the ship." Marcus nodded, though no one could see him. "I'll work on locking it out of the core systems. But if it's as adaptive as it seems, this won't be easy." As the crew scrambled to contain the entity's influence, the ship seemed to come alive, its systems flickering and pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Elena's voice cut through the chaos. "Whatever it takes, we're not letting this thing spread. We stop it here." But deep down, each of them knew the truth. The entity was no longer just a threat confined to the Erebus. It was something far more dangerous, a virus, a parasite, a sentient force that could adapt, evolve, and spread. And now, it had found a new vessel. The crew of the Helios 7 worked frantically to counter the spreading influence of the entity. The ship's systems were failing one by one, lights flickering as though the vessel itself were struggling against an unseen invader. The hum of the engines now carried a dissonant undertone, a sound that sent shivers down the spines of the survivors. Elena stood at the center of the bridge, her voice calm but firm as she barked orders. "Marcus, how long until you can isolate the entity in the ship's core?" Marcus's hands flew across his console, sweat dripping from his forehead. "I'm rerouting power and sealing off critical systems, but it's fighting back. Every time I close a door, it opens another. It's like it's learning as we go." Jonas, standing nearby with a weapon in hand, glanced nervously at the screens, where distorted images flickered. "What do you mean, learning?" "It's software. It shouldn't be able to adapt like this." Layla, monitoring life support systems from a secondary console, chimed in. "It's not just software, Jonas. It's something else, something alive. And it's using the ship as a host." The words hung heavy in the air, the implications chilling. Elena clenched her fists, her mind racing. "Then we have to cut it off completely," she said. "If we can isolate it in one section of the ship, we might be able to eject that section and destroy it." Marcus hesitated, his hands pausing over the controls. "That might work, but it's risky. If we lose control of the ejection systems, we could end up blowing ourselves apart instead." "We don't have a choice," Elena said, her voice unwavering. "If this thing gets out, it won't just stop with us. It'll spread to every ship, every station it can find. We have to end this here." As Marcus worked to implement the plan, the entity's presence became more pronounced. The ship's walls seemed to pulse faintly, and a low, rhythmic vibration echoed through the hull. Shadows danced across the flickering lights, shapes that shouldn't have been there. Layla's voice broke through the tense silence. "Elena, life support is failing on Deck 3. Whatever this thing is doing, It's targeting critical systems. Then we need to move faster, Elena said, turning to Jonas. Arm yourself. If this thing tries to manifest physically, we need to be ready. Jonas nodded, gripping his weapon tightly as his eyes darted nervously around the room. Ready as I'll ever be, he muttered. Suddenly, the bridge lights dimmed, and the ship's intercom crackled to life. The distorted, inhuman voice of the entity echoed through the room. You think you can contain me? You are nothing. Your resistance is meaningless. Elena stepped forward, her jaw set. You're wrong, she said, addressing the entity directly. We're not nothing. And you're not invincible. The voice let out a guttural laugh, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ship. We shall see. At that moment, the ship lurched violently, throwing the crew off balance. Sparks rained down from damaged panels, and a deep groaning sound reverberated through the hull. Marcus's voice rose above the chaos. It's trying to overload the reactor. If it succeeds, we're all dead. Elena grabbed the edge of a console, her eyes narrowing. Marcus, focus on locking it out of the reactor. Layla, get down to engineering and stabilize the core. Jonas, you're with me. We're going to give Marcus the time he needs. The team moved with purpose, their fear tempered by the resolve to survive. Layla sprinted toward the engineering section, her heart pounding as she navigated the darkened corridors. The ship groaned around her, the entity's influence growing stronger with every passing second. Meanwhile, Elena and Jonas made their way to the auxiliary control room, where they could manually sever the entity's access to the ship's systems. As they worked, the air around them seemed to thicken, and a faint, otherworldly whispering filled their ears. Do you hear that? Jonas asked, his voice barely audible. Ignore it, Elena said, her fingers flying over the controls. It's trying to distract us. Focus on the task. Back on the bridge, Marcus stared at his screen, his hands trembling as he fought to outmaneuver the entity. Come on, he muttered under his breath. Just a little more time. The entity, sensing the crew's plan, lashed out with renewed fury. Panels exploded in showers of sparks, and a deep, guttural roar echoed through the ship. Marcus flinched as the console in front of him went dark. Elena, I've lost control of the reactor interface. Elena's voice crackled over the comms. We're almost there. Hold on. In the engineering section, Layla fought to stabilize the reactor, her hands moving with practiced precision. The heat was oppressive, and the sound of the reactor's strain was deafening. She gritted her teeth, refusing to give up. Finally, Elena and Jonas succeeded in isolating the entity, trapping it within the ship's data core. Marcus, it's done. Elena shouted. Eject the data core now. Marcus didn't hesitate. With a final command, the data core detached from the ship, hurtling into the void. The moment it was gone, the ship fell silent, the oppressive presence lifting. The crew collapsed in relief, their exhaustion overwhelming. But as they stared out the windows, watching the core drift away, a chilling thought crossed their minds. Do you think it's really gone? Jonas asked softly. Elena didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the void. Deep down, she knew the truth. The entity might have been contained, but something that powerful was never truly destroyed. To be continued.